It's My Nerd World, a Star Wars show, and it has been a long time since I have been this hyped up and thrilled at a piece of Star Wars content. On this week's episode, I want to talk about Episode 6, The Eye, in the live-action streaming show Andor, which, in my opinion, is the best piece of Disney, Star Wars, Lucasfilm content that they have put out so far. I will present to you my case and what I loved about this episode right now, here on My Nerd World, a Star Wars show.
Nothing will stand in our way.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
I will finish what you started.
Who are you? I'm no one.
There are stories about what happened.
It's true. All of it.
The Force. It's calling to you. Just let it in.
Star Wars will always be, and should be, different things to appeal to different generations, to boys, to girls. It should never be one singular thing. George Lucas has always said that Star Wars is meant for kids. I'm going to steal this from Christian Harloff on the Sith Council podcast, but he's absolutely right when he says, yeah, but those children have grown up and are adults now, like myself. And so we can create and have presented to us content that is more in line with the age of the audience. You can have shows like Star Wars Resistance and animated series like The Bad Batch and Clone Wars that can appeal to different generations. You can have your 2D animation to even younger audiences. We need all of this. And so Star Wars should always be different and changing and in some ways challenging. So as I get into my commentary about Andor Episode 6, I want to make sure that I stayed up front, that I don't want Star Wars to always be like this. I'm just really, really ecstatic that at the moment, the Star Wars we're getting is like this. Because I wrapped up watching Episode 6, The Eye, of the Andor series yesterday, and that was the most thrilled and emotionally moved that I have been on a piece of Star Wars content, specifically because of the storytelling. Then, my gosh, I don't know how long. I remember loving the films, Force Awakens and Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker, and being emotionally moved during those films, but for different reasons. A lot of that coming down to nostalgia, the closing of a chapter. This show, with its storytelling alone, brought me to the point of tears and genuine concern for the characters in the show. And again, I don't anticipate, expect, or want all Star Wars to be like Andor, but the more Star Wars we get like Andor, I am absolutely 100% on board. I cannot wait to sit back down later today and watch this episode again. So let's go ahead and start from the beginning, and I'll work through what I really loved about the show. And at any point, obviously, if you want to comment, you can email me, talkshownerd@gmail.com, or if you're listening on YouTube, leave a comment up on YouTube as well. But the lead up to this week's episode has really been fantastic. I was, as I mentioned, and you listened to previous episodes, I was a little hesitant to embrace the show in its first two episodes, because it was lacking, as I mentioned before, what I typically expect from Star Wars. And that's where my conflict personally came into it in terms of my criticism of the show. I went in with certain expectations of getting more pew-pew and explosions and spaceships, and that's typically sort of combined with Star Wars. Even when you have sort of slower elements within Star Wars, you usually end up with those things. And those first 2 episodes, and actually the first 3, didn't really deliver on that. And arguably, it didn't even really deliver until episode 6. But once I began to realize what type of show I was watching, I could then sort of sit back and embrace it for what it was. For example, when I go into watching House of the Dragon, I don't have any expectations. And much of House of the Dragon really is just people talking and dialogue, but the writing is really good. The dynamics and the intrigue and the drama and the politics is enough to keep you sustained. And when I was watching Andor, I'm watching Star Wars, but my brain is going, I'm waiting for stormtroopers. I'm waiting for more spaceships. I'm waiting for space battles. But the writing was great and the story was great. I was never, ever bored. And when the episodes were over, I wanted more. So once I was able to embrace personally what the show was, then I really began to appreciate it. This particular episode, however, delivered on what I typically expect from Star Wars and did it in a way that thrilled me, that moved me, and entertained me all at once. I have written my science fiction space opera series. This is not a shameless plug. I'm using this to sort of present my opinion on why I love this show. One of the things that I love about watching The Martian, it's a go-to for me, it's an infinitely rewatchable movie for me, is that in my EMBARK science fiction series, a lot of it takes place on Mars. It plays a significant role in the first book, the whole climax of the book. And as a matter of fact, it's kind of bookended. The first book and the last book, the climax actually take place on Mars. And when I watch The Martian, I often will look at the way that movie was shot and just how real it looks. You feel like you're on Mars there with Mark Watney. And I've thought quite a bit about how, man, I would love to see, from a visual standpoint, I would love to see a Star Wars movie look as good as this. Now, the movies come close to it, don't misunderstand. The Force, all 3 of the sequel trilogy films are all beautifully shot, in my opinion. But there still is sort of a disconnect in reality. When you watch The Rise of Skywalker, they shot a lot of the sequences in that film were shot in the same locale as where they shot the sequences for The Martian. But they just, the cinematography is much different. And I guess that's really what I'm driving at. I wanted to see a film or a Star Wars content that matched the cinematography of what I saw in The Martian. And I always envisioned in my grandest of dreams of having my EMBARK science fiction series turned into a feature film or series of films. I always envisioned, I would love for my movies to look as good as the Martian. And what would Star Wars look like through that lens? That's what Andor is to me. That's how it looks to me. It looks that real. Coruscant looks a little different. The Senate looks a little different. But that's okay. It's all very cohesive. It is grounded in a reality that's still taking place in this galaxy far, far away. And to drive my point home further, one of the reasons why I think Andor, in my opinion, is working as well as it is that this is the first time, and I could be wrong, but in my opinion, this is the first time we've had a piece of Star Wars content not created by George Lucas, but created like George Lucas created the original Star Wars. When George Lucas created the original Star Wars, he didn't create it going, I need to have A, B, C, D, E, F, and G so that this looks like Star Wars. He had this idea of a galaxy far, far away, but ultimately he had a story. And the story was first and foremost. And he had an idea that he wanted this lived-in universe. bringing in Ralph McQuarrie to a former artist for Boeing to do the concept art, to present to the studios what the film could look like. So you were already sort of centered in a bit of reality with this artwork that Ralph McQuarrie was doing, that George Lucas was able to use to convince Fox Studios and Alan Ladd to create the film. But when George Lucas made the movie, he wasn't thinking, this is Star Wars, it has to look like this. He was just creating it. With what Tony Gilroy has done with Andor, it's the first time that I think that same type of mentality has been used to create a piece of Star Wars content. Tony Gilroy was not a fan of Star Wars when he did Rogue One, when he came in and made the changes that he made to that film. He didn't really know the Star Wars universe, but he had people around him that could go and craft the galaxy the way it was supposed to look so it fit within the story he wanted to tell. And then even more so because they were already sort of down the line and down the road of creating that, because most of the film had been shot and Tony Gilroy kind of came in to make it what it was and what we love today. So when Tony Gilroy goes to make Andor, he's got this story of political intrigue, of a spy thriller mystery, something that's a bit of a slower burn with a lot of really good, meaty dialogue to chew on. The story all came first. You could take the story that has been presented in Andor and you could go and manipulate it and change it to fit all kinds of different time periods in the real world or a different sort of fantasy film. He didn't go into it writing a story that says, okay, I need to include A, B, C, D, E, F, and G to make this Star Wars. No, here's my story. How does this story fit into the fabric of Star Wars so that this is a Star Wars show, but I'm still telling my story? And we do have nods to Star Wars, obviously. It looks and feels like Star Wars, but I think that's also why those first handful of episodes, you didn't really get a lot of fan service, if you will. And I think if ever, the fan service terminology actually works, because I don't think Tony Gilroy had any expectation. I don't need to serve the fans here. I need to serve my story. If we include things the fans enjoy from previous Star Wars stuff, that's great. And so I think that's where the story group really comes into play in a very, very relevant way. I chuckled a little bit because you probably didn't notice it, but I did. During episode 6, there's a moment where some officers are presenting drinks to, I think, one of the sergeants or majors within the Imperial ranks. The glasses they're using are the glasses, the same types of glasses that were used in Solo on Dryden Voss's yacht towards the beginning of the film, before they set off on their adventure and go to meet Lando, when Han Solo is reunited with Kira for the first time. I'll never forget the glasses. They're drinking this sort of pinkish, liquid in Solo, and in Andor, he walks in and those are the same glasses. And I was like, oh hey, those are the Solo glasses. And we talked about the Easter eggs and the different references in Luthen's gallery that point to different canonized things, and we do have those Star Wars influences in there. But this was a story that was crafted and created with the story first, and not an individual going, I have to make a Star Wars film. And so therefore, I'm going to write a story and inject all this stuff into it to make sure it's Star Wars. Gilroy just said, here's the story, let's make it fit into Star Wars. The build up to episode 6 has just been absolutely spot on. I think we all knew and expected that we were going to get this heist in this episode, as I've said many times, as have the showrunners and content creators around Andor. These stories are happening in 3-episode arcs with a director handling all 3 episodes. And so we did the 6th episode. We'll get another 3-story arc, which will conclude, with the 3rd story being the culmination of the first 2, and then we'll do it for the next 2 leading up to episode 12 before we'll take a break before we get into episode 2. But everything about this episode and the build up to the heist just absolutely worked. The opening dialogue between Nemec and Cassian Andor, an extension from what took place in the previous episode, reestablishing how Nemec is sort of a true believer in the cause, but you can see how nervous he was. And there was a bit of foreshadowing. There'll be spoilers here, but obviously a bit of foreshadowing as to what would end up happening to him in the end, even though I was hoping it wouldn't, but it did. Did not see at all the turn of Skeen at the end of the episode that I'll talk more about here in a bit. But now that it's happened, when you go back and think about or watch all the previous commentary that took place between Skeen and specifically Andor, you begin to see, oh, okay, the scheming that was taking place. The fact that we got a little bit more backstory on Barcona and found out that he, like Finn, used to be a stormtrooper, and how that was playing into his role as they began to go out on this particular mission. Seeing the nervousness and the anxiousness, especially with Vel, as Vel and Cinta had gone to the facility ahead of them to go and lay the groundwork for the heist to take place. It really is, again, just embedded with a sense of realism that we haven't, in my opinion, gotten from a lot of recent Star Wars content. This show, in my opinion, makes Kenobi look campy by comparison, and it makes me scratch my head even more. I know people loved Kenobi and don't have any issues with it. Most of my biggest problems, as I've mentioned with Kenobi, were simply the production value of it. They're just simple things that do not make any sense. And one that I didn't even talk about before, but after the escape in those last couple of episodes, when Darth Vader brought down the ship before there was a secondary ship that you didn't realize was there, took off, and then at some point, Obi-Wan Kenobi leaves that ship in this shuttle that's almost half the size of the ship. And it's like there's just certain things that just do not make any sense whatsoever. It's almost as if these shows were created by two different studios. I do not understand it. That we can get a show that is so carefully crafted and looks like it belongs on the big screen compared to what we got in Kenobi. I do not understand. But be it as it may, this goes back to my initial commentary at the start of the podcast, and that is, Star Wars can be a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Getting back to Andor, once we got into the actual heist in and of itself, it simply did not disappoint. It didn't go the way that they had hoped it would go, which is, typical in circumstances like this. You felt all of the stakes. You felt the oppression of the Empire as the native people arrived to watch this, what they perceived as a celestial event in the eye. Little tiny pieces of storytelling that I think get lost in the mix. The conversation between the Imperial officers as they were discussing the natives there arriving, saying they started off with 500 people, but we ended up placing these comfort pods along the way, which, with housing and a bar and a restaurant and, maybe it didn't go that far, but basically these little tiny makeshift towns that had dwindled their ranks down to, he said, 60 by the end of it. I mean, there's just little tiny pieces of information and dialogue that all just adds to the rich world building taking place within this episode. Once we get into the actual heist aspect of it, I mean, it was game on, and it didn't disappoint on any level. It's interesting, too, because the show itself is taking some very very interesting choices, like the laser fire. Was a little off-putting to me because it didn't sound like your typical laser fire that you would see within Star Wars. And there was a point where, again, my brain's going, okay, I know that's a laser. I know those guns look familiar. Those are laser guns. At the same time, the lasers don't sound the same. But then you get used to it and you realize, no, but this is actually working better. The tone of it and the pitch is sort of dialed down, where even the laser sounds don't sound as pew-pewy as what you would get in your typical Star Wars. It all seems very carefully crafted and manicured, even around the edges, to make sure that everything seems as cohesive as possible. you get into the latter part of the heist, and they finally take off on this shuttle. And it was at this moment, because this is where the parts of Star Wars that I love come into play. We got all this fantastic political intrigue. We get this really great action sequence. We see some of our characters. Barcona ends up being killed in the middle of this. We end up losing Lieutenant Gorn in the middle of this fight. Each of these characters sort of have their little moment before they die, but then we don't linger on those deaths. They had their moment. They had their piece of dialogue. They're dead. They're gone. The story is moving forward, and we are on this ride with the remaining members of this crew as they attempt to escape this Imperial compound. We don't lose Nemik. We feel like something's going to happen to Nemik. There seems to be some foreshadowing at the beginning of the episode in that conversation that he's having, which is kind of a rehash from the great dialogue that we had last week of Nemik and Skeen talking about how he's writing a manifesto and what this rebellion could be like. But yet, once they take off, Nemik ends up getting hurt when the credits they've stolen come crashing into him, and you just know that this kid's not gonna make it through it. And then you get into the actual escape from the compound and the planet. And this is where my mouth just dropped open and my eyes went wide. I've been waiting, and this is the one question that I've had watching the show, knowing that eventually we're going to get into your typical Star Wars territory of spaceships and stormtroopers. How are they going to handle that within what they've shown us so far? Because what they've shown us is something that has a very real-world feel. You feel very grounded watching it. When they begin to get into the more fantastical, in my opinion, and TIE fighters aren't fantastical, but when you start getting into your sort of typical, all right, we're seeing stormtroopers now. If Vader comes into the mix or Palpatine comes into the mix, how is this going to fit? Because you could have Vader in this show, and by all intents and purposes, the way this show has been crafted, it could potentially look hokey. I'm not worried about it anymore. When they take off from the planet, and then we cut to the fact that one of the officers there has figured out what's going on, they've disrupted the heist, they've been able to call for help from a nearby airfield, and then we get this amazing sequence of these TIE fighter pilots heading to their ships. And this is what I was waiting for. I love my ships. We actually get to see, I didn't know this was going to happen, but we actually get to see TIE fighter pilots running to their ships and then actually getting down inside of a TIE fighter. Now, I know we saw Moff Gideon in Andor coming out of the top of the TIE fighter. Okay, so I know we have seen that. We have seen that before. That being said, we've never really seen, we've seen TIE fighters hanging there before, but to see sort of the full rigmarole process of the hatch opening up and climbing down the ladder and getting in. And even though the inside of the cockpit looks like what we've seen before, it just looked more realistic than I ever imagined. And we get this amazing sequence of some of the most stunning visuals I've ever seen Star Wars create. I would have loved to have seen this on the big screen. With Andor piloting this cargo shuttle into this celestial event of these meteors, just the most grand northern lights display you've ever seen, coupled with the fact that we know Nemik is dying, but yet he's the only one that can help Andor navigate through this as the TIE fighters come in and are pursuing them. I mean, just this sequence was thrilling, does not begin to tell you how much I enjoyed this. And coming to tears at every death of these characters, whether it was Gorn, whether it was Barcona, and certainly afterwards, and I'll get to this in a moment, when Nemik ends up passing away, I was almost brought to the point of tears. There was a moment when I was brought to the point of tears. So we get through this amazing sequence, this chase sequence. These TIE fighters get taken out because of what they're going through with the eye, this tense moment of navigating through this massive event in space until once they're in the clear. And I'm thinking in my mind, this is the culmination. This is the end of the episode. We're going to cut to black here, and then we'll have to wait till next week to see what happens. And then much to my surprise, it didn't end. The episode kept going. I was like, oh my gosh, we're not done. And this was where I was like, oh wow, this episode's really something special. It would have been very typical for Star Wars and the content that we get to just go, action sequence, we're cutting to black, we'll pick up the story later on next week. But we weren't done yet. The emotional part of this was not over. There was still another facet to this. This decision has to be made. Do they continue to their destination? Cinta's left behind. We assume she'll mix in with the natives on the planet and hopefully, rendezvous with Vel and with Andor at some point. But then there's this moment of indecision of whether or not they go to another location, to a doctor, to see if they can save Nemik, or if they head on to where they need to go. And Andor makes the decision to go to this planet, to this four-armed doctor to try to heal Nemik. And while that's going on, we get this conversation between Skeen and Andor, and then suddenly you're like, oh, wow, this whole thing could take a massive, massive turn. And what does Andor do? Andor knows what he has to do. He has to kill Skeen. If he goes along with Skeen, he turns his back on the people that he went and helped. If he says no, which is more in line with Andor's behavior, he just wants to get paid. He knows that Skeen probably is not going to let him say no at this point in time. He has no other choice. And what I loved about it too was that even when Skeen went and said, when Andor's like, but what about your brother, the story you told me? And Skeen says, I don't have a brother. My first read on that was him saying, I don't have a brother because my brother's already dead. And it was only later that I kind of dawned on me. And I go, oh, he lied about his brother the whole time. There never was a brother in the first place. He was telling the truth. And keeping consistent with Andor, he goes in, he's like, look, man, I just want my cut of the money, and I'll get out of here. But then Nemik dies. Vel begins to see what's happened, believes Andor. And now these are the only two left along with Cinta. I mean, just the story elements of this, again, bringing more emotional and emotional weight and gravity to the situation, even after they went and pulled the heist off, but at this horrible, horrible cost. And then we're still not done. We get to the end of the episode to find Luthen on Coruscant, there in his art gallery, in his antiquity gallery, and there's a guy there asking, hey, do you have anything from Aldhani to sell? And he's like, why? He's like, apparently there was some sort of rebel incursion. And then we follow Luthen into the back of his shop where he has this little celebratory moment to himself that they ended up pulling this off, obviously unaware of the price that ended up having to be paid in pulling this off. This was some of the best storytelling, if not the best storytelling, and in my opinion, the single best piece of Star Wars content, live-action content that they put out so far. So where I think this whole thing is going is with the scene that was included at the end, where you had the Imperial Major bringing all of his officers and all of the people under his command together, knowing what has taken place. We know, based off of some of the trailers, that there's a moment where Luthen in his ship, in his Fondor Holcraft, end up taking off from a planet and have to escape Imperial forces, including that newer design, older design Star Destroyer, the one with the discs on it. That was actually a piece of concept art for an original Star Destroyer. Back when George Lucas made the first Star Wars, and they turned it into a different ship. I forget. I think it's called an suppressor. But we know that there's a moment where he takes off, the ship spins, lasers come out the side of it, take out the ships, and they blast off. My assumption is that Luthen is going to somehow get exposed as the Empire begins to go and search for who was involved in this, and probably begins to pick up the breadcrumbs that lead eventually to Luthen, and probably at some point eventually to Mon Mothma, because we know that she ends up leaving the Senate and joining the rebellion at some point in time prior to the dissolving of the Senate that takes place in A New Hope via the dialogue from Vader to Tarkin, when Tarkin says that the Emperor has dissolved the council permanently. The last remnants of the old Republic have been swept away. So, my guess would be the next 3 episodes are going to be the Empire tracking down who's responsible, and more than likely Luthen, if not Luthen and Mon Mothma, having to flee Coruscant after being found out by the Empire of having been involved. The one moment in the show, though, that really brought me to tears was the passing of, after the passing of Nemec, and the thing that convinced Andor to, in my opinion, stay with Vel was when she had his journal, Nemec's journal, and she said he wanted this, and Andor's like, I don't want it. He's like, no, he insisted that I give this to you if something were to happen to him. The way that they had crafted the relationship between those two, the dialogue that had taken place, and how the connection that those two had just really impacted me, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is just absolutely fantastic. What do you think? TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. This is the most that I've been excited about Star Wars in a long, long time. And I love Mandalorian, and it's different, and it's exciting, and it's adventure. But for me, at the moment, this single episode, and really, you put this episode here at just under like 47 minutes, you put it with another, with the other episode, you've got like a movie. It was funny, I was flipping through one of the streaming services, and they have a compilation to choose from of Halloween films, and they have all the old Hollywood horror films, your Dracula, your Frankenstein, Creature from the Black Lagoon, back from the 1930s, right? 1931, I think, like roughly the hours that are roughly the years that those were in. And you look at the time on them, it was like an hour and 9 minutes, an hour and 10 minutes. You take a couple of episodes here, or just this 3-story arc, and you've got a fantastic film that really is up there with, in terms of the quality, is up there with a Rogue One easily. Man, what a great piece of Star Wars content. So again, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. You can also leave a comment up on YouTube as well. We do have some listener feedback to get to this week.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
All right, friend of the show, Ed Lowe from the Lowdown Show on YouTube says, glad you're doing better. I'm glad the 4th episode turned you around. This is a different Star Wars, but sometimes change is good. Look forward to hearing more reviews from you. Thank you, Edwin. Appreciate it. Friend of the show, SheVP writes in on a couple of different notes. First one, talking about the episode after episode 4. This episode was so good. In fact, I was sort of startled when it ended because I was so engrossed in it. I'm so excited for more. I meant to tell you, John, that I absolutely loved Light and Magic. I didn't even know about it, so thank you so much for the recommendation. It was so cool to see all of these amazing, talented people working together to create history. I kind of felt bad for Dykstra after episode 4, but in the end, I guess everything worked out the way it was supposed to. They also wrote in with regard to last week's episode, and they write, as a fellow conservative, John, I couldn't have said it better myself. And just adding my own commentary here going into the show, I knew from what perspective the creators were coming from. I accepted it and decided I would just try to enjoy it for what it was, new and fresh Star Wars. Me too. And I'm really enjoying it. I can separate someone's political views from their work. I can too. Din Djarin is now my all-time favorite Star Wars character, and I absolutely adore Pedro Pascal, even though he thinks someone like me is a Nazi. And that's what's so unfortunate about so much of this. Again, I don't want to go off on a political rant. I did that for a little bit last week. Probably would have done more, but my voice was giving out on me. But I wish there was more acceptance across the board from all sides of the political spectrum. When Lucasfilm fired Gina for basically not being a liberal, I just shook my head. when Luke, let me back up here. I'm sorry. When he was posting a lot of that garbage on his Twitter, I just shook my head. When Lucasfilm fired Gina for basically not being a liberal, I still continue to love The Mandalorian. As a customer, all I want from creators is good content. I don't want to be preached at. And by the way, when you said that Gilroy likens Mon Mothma to Pelosi, I literally cackled out loud. Still getting rid of this cold. Thank you, SheVP. I appreciate that. All right, and friend of the show, Miranda, writes in, for almost half a dozen episodes in, I feel as though we're in the middle of a theatrical play on stage, which is kind of nice for a change. I do like that we can actually spend time watching people speak to one another, or just be present in the scene. We're seeing actors deliver lines the way you would see them as if it was on stage. It really, and just to add a point on there, again, kind of going back to my Game of Thrones House of the Dragon analogy, I don't complain watching House of the Dragon that there was no dragon sequences in there, so no action sequences, because the writing is so good and compelling, and that's the same thing that's happening with Andor, in my opinion. We're watching this like we're a live audience, and we feel something real going on. I always thought the best moments in any of these Star Wars movies and shows have been when the characters don't need to say anything, just let their body language and facial expression give you the feeling of what's going on. But I think it's also just as powerful when there's an actor that can just deliver a line and have that make you believe that the actor is bringing something real to this character, or he or she has transformed and created, or he or she has transformed and created. That, to me, is the beauty of acting. As a formal drama student that studied theater arts, I like what we're seeing Star Wars become like theater for once. By the way, Love Hypothesis is going to be box office gold. Let's make it number one. Raylo fan family, ladies and gents and dogs, if you can take them to the theater. And this goes back to something I mentioned briefly last week. Per Deadline, the studio behind Netflix recent adaptation of Jane Austen's Persuasion, they're tackling a movie version of The Love Hypothesis, which is a romantic comedy storyline with characters that were inspired by Daisy Ridley and Adam Driver's Star Wars on-screen romance. So, again, Love Hypothesis is potentially being made into a film. And I talked about this before, just how a lot of the Raylo fanfic has become incredibly popular, and understandably so. And I agree with you on your points as it relates to Andor as well. I'm so excited for the rest of this series, and again, I can't wait to sit down and watch episode 6 again. Thank you so much for checking out the episode. I hope that you will also go and check out my EMBARK science fiction space opera series, where you can follow a ragtag squadron of pilots and one reluctant hero on a journey of survival from Earth to the far reaches of space as they fight for humanity's future among the stars. Treat yourself, a friend, or a family member with science fiction. It's written for adults, but great for ages 11 and older. You can buy EMBARK Book 1 today in ebook for just 99 cents. Pick up the trilogy in the first 3 books in the 7-book completed series for just $3.99 in ebook. It's also available in hardcover, paperback, and audiobook. If you like your science fiction space opera epic and filled with romance and action, EMBARK is perfect for you. You can go to Amazon.com or mynerdworld.net to pick up your preferred copy. On Amazon, just search for Jon, Jon Justice, and EMBARK. You can also follow me on my social media, at the Jon Justice on both TikTok and Instagram. You can also follow me on Twitter at Jon Jon Justice or at the My Nerd World. So you can go and follow me on social media. Find me on Jon Jon Justice on Facebook as well. I think I still have some slots open. I did some purging of friends recently, so could probably take a few friend requests and confirm them if you happen to be on Facebook. All right, that wraps up the show for this week. I will be back again next week with my thoughts on episode 7 as we start the next 3 in the Andor series. Oh, go watch episode 6 again. Have yourself a fantastic day, and wherever you are, I hope you are happy, that you're healthy, and you're safe. I'll talk to you again real soon. Bye.
The Force will be with you, always.
My Nerd World.